The first thing you should know about Route 19 is that nothing about it looks dangerous in daylight. The road runs through flat farmland and open fields, and during the afternoon the sun sits high enough that every shadow should fall clean and predictable. But 3 years ago, on a quiet Thursday at 2:15 in the afternoon, I saw a shadow on that road that did not belong to anything. I have never told the full story before. Not to my family and not to the police officer who stopped by later that evening. The only reason I'm sharing it now is because people who watch the channel Unblinking understand that some stories sound impossible until someone finally speaks up. If you're listening right now, stay with me until the end, because what happened on Route 19 still doesn't make sense even after all this time. And before we go further, if you enjoy real feeling scary stories like this one, take a second to like the video and subscribe to Unblinking so you don't miss the next story. It really helps the channel grow, and honestly, after what I experienced, I think more people should know about places like Route 19. Back then I worked as a rural road inspection contractor. My job was simple. Drive long stretches of secondary highways, take photos of cracks, faded signs, damaged guardrails, and send reports back to the county office. It was quiet work, mostly done during the day when visibility was good. Route 19 was one of the dullest assignments I had. The road cut between wheat fields for almost 20 miles, with barely a house in sight. There were no gas stations, no traffic lights, and most of the time I could drive 10 minutes without seeing another vehicle. That afternoon, the sky was clear and bright. The sun was high enough that shadows were short and tight beneath objects. I remember that detail clearly because I had been taking photos of a broken mile marker and checking how the shadow from the post fell directly under it. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed a shadow stretching across the road that shouldn't have existed. At first it looked like a long, thin shape lying over the asphalt. It ran diagonally from one side of the road toward the other, like the shadow of a tall pole or a telephone line, but there were no poles nearby. I slowed my truck and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. There was nothing there, just a dark shape on the pavement. I assumed it was a cloud passing overhead, but when I looked up, the sky was completely empty. No clouds, no birds, nothing large enough to block the sun. The strange part was that the shadow didn't move. Normally shadows shift slowly as the sun changes angle, but this one stayed in the same place while I drove closer. I stopped the truck about 10 feet before reaching it. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the road. The shadow looked thin and crooked, almost like the outline of a tall figure leaning slightly forward. It stretched nearly 12 feet across the pavement, even though nothing nearby could have cast it. I got out of the truck to check. The air was warm and still. Grass on both sides of the road moved gently in the wind, and insects buzzed somewhere in the fields, but the shadow remained perfectly dark on the road. I stepped closer and stood beside it. The moment I moved into its edge, something strange happened. My own shadow disappeared. I looked down quickly. The sun was still above me, bright and strong, but my shadow was gone from the pavement. It was like the strange shadow had swallowed it. I stepped back, and my shadow returned. I stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what I was seeing. Maybe my eyes were adjusting to the brightness. Maybe the asphalt surface was reflecting light in a strange way. Sleep deprivation can do strange things, and I had worked several long shifts that week, so I convinced myself it was nothing serious. I stepped across the shadow. For a second, everything felt normal. Then the sound around me changed. The wind and the grass faded until I couldn't hear it anymore. The buzzing insects stopped. Even the distant hum of my truck engine sounded muffled. It wasn't silence exactly. It felt like the world had moved a few feet away from me. I looked behind me. The truck sat exactly where I left it, but something about it felt slightly wrong. The sunlight around it looked duller, like a thin film had been placed over the scene. I stepped back out of the shadow. The sounds returned instantly. Wind, insects, engine noise. Everything normal again. That's when a small feeling of unease settled in my stomach. I told myself I was imagining things, but curiosity pushed me to try again. I stepped back into the shadow. The quiet returned. Not total silence, but a strange pressure in the air, like being inside a room with thick walls. And this time something else changed. The shadow moved. Not quickly, just a slight shift along the pavement, as if it had stretched a little farther. I stepped out again. The shadow stopped moving. For a few seconds, I stood there thinking about how ridiculous the situation felt. A grown adult standing in the middle of an empty highway, testing a shadow like it was some kind of science experiment. But something inside me kept saying the same thing. That shadow was not behaving like a shadow. I walked back to the truck and grabbed my phone to take a picture. When I pointed the camera at the road, the shadow wasn't visible on the screen. I lowered the phone and looked directly at the pavement. The shadow was still there. I raised the phone again. Nothing. Just empty asphalt. I took the photo anyway. When I checked the image later, it showed a perfectly normal road with sunlight across it. No shadow. At that point, I should have driven away. Instead, I stepped into it again. And this time the world changed in a way I still struggled to describe. The road stretched longer, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed the next mile marker looked farther away than before. The wheat fields seemed slightly dimmer, like the sun had lost a small part of its brightness. I turned around toward the truck. It looked farther away too, maybe 5 or 6 steps farther than where I remembered parking it. My heartbeat started to rise. I walked out of the shadow. Everything snapped back to normal distance. The truck returned to its original location. I stood there breathing slowly, trying to calm myself down. Maybe heat distortion from the pavement was messing with my eyes. Maybe the sunlight was creating some strange optical illusion. Still, something about the situation felt wrong. I decided to do one last check before leaving. I stepped inside the shadow again. This time I stayed still. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the shadow slowly shifted again. It stretched longer across the road, and when I looked down, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The shadow now had 2 shapes inside it. One looked like the crooked outline I had seen before. The second shape looked exactly like me. My own silhouette appeared beside it, even though my real shadow should have been somewhere else. I quickly stepped out. My shadow returned to normal, but the strange one was still there. And now, it looked slightly taller. That was the moment I decided to leave. I got back into the truck, started the engine, and drove forward. As the tires rolled over the shadow, the temperature inside the truck dropped suddenly. The air conditioner wasn't on, but cold air brushed across my hands on the steering wheel. It lasted less than a second. Then the sunlight returned to normal warmth. I checked the rearview mirror. The shadow remained on the road behind me. But something about it looked different. It was longer than before. Almost reaching the center line now. I kept driving. About a mile down the road, I stopped again to take photos of a damaged sign. When I stepped out of the truck and looked at the pavement, my heart sank. There was another shadow. Same shape, same crooked outline stretching across the road ahead of me. I turned around quickly. The road behind me was empty. No sign of the first shadow. A slow realization started forming in my mind. It hadn't stayed in one place. Eat, ad, mobile. Over the next 30 minutes, I saw the shadow 4 more times along Route 19. Each time, it appeared ahead of me on the road, stretched slightly longer than before. Every time I stepped into it, the world felt quieter and slightly distorted. Distances changed. Sunlight dimmed, and the shape inside the shadow grew clearer. By the 5th time, the second silhouette inside the darkness no longer looked exactly like mine. Its shoulders were slightly higher. Its head leaned forward in a way my body did not. I stopped stepping inside after that. I finished the inspection route as quickly as possible and returned to the county office before evening. I didn't mention the shadow in my report. Honestly, I convinced myself it had all been stress, but that night something happened that I couldn't ignore. When I parked my truck at home and stepped out under the porch light, I noticed my shadow stretching across the driveway, and for a brief moment, another shadow stood beside it. Not touching, just slightly behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there. The second shadow disappeared. I checked again under different lights around the house. Everything looked normal. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my brain was still replaying the strange things I had seen earlier. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, the memory faded enough that I stopped thinking about it every night, until the phone call. It came from a different road inspector who had been assigned to Route 19 after me. He asked if I had ever noticed anything strange on that road. I hesitated before answering. Then I asked him why. There was a long pause. Finally, he said something that made the back of my neck tighten. He said he kept seeing a shadow on the road that didn't belong to anything. And sometimes, when he stepped inside it, he felt like the world around him shifted slightly out of place. I didn't tell him the full story. I only said that Route 19 had strange lighting conditions sometimes. But after that call, I stopped driving that highway completely. Maybe stress played tricks on my mind. Or maybe some places carry things we simply don't understand. But one thing I believe with certainty is this. Everything happens by the will of Allah. Nothing moves, nothing changes, and nothing touches our lives without His knowledge. Everything happens according to Allah's will. And maybe some questions are not meant to be answered. Still, every now and then, when the afternoon sun hits the ground just right, I look down at the pavement and check the shape of my shadow. Most of the time there's only one. But once, about 6 months ago, I saw a second shape stretch beside it for just a moment. And when I turned around to see what could be casting it, the road behind me was completely empty. If you've ever driven a quiet highway in the middle of the day and noticed something strange about the shadows on the road, I'd really like to hear about it. Leave a comment below and share your experience. Because stories like this are the reason people keep coming back to them. And if you think someone else would find this story unsettling, share the video with them too. Because the unsettling truth about Route 19 is this. No one has ever explained why that shadow appears in daylight. But according to the latest inspection logs, it has now been reported by 3 different drivers, and every one of them said the same thing. Each time they saw it again, it was a little longer than before.